13. Total eclipse. A seeker of silences am I, and what treasures I have found in silences that I may dispense with confidence. The Prophet Khalil Gibran. The doctor reeled aside, clutching his face in agony. The Timewyrm guffawed. When you might have destroyed me, Time Lord, you chose to return. You revealed your weakness. Your weakness is the girl. I know you better than you know yourself. No! The doctor removed his hands from his face with a flourish and stood up once more. He was unharmed. You don't. The last words were a whisper, but the ancient strength they conveyed hushed the demonic audience. Every one of them had heard that sound, banishing them from turbulent dreams, horrific visions. It was the word of the wise man, the force of rationality. How? Exclaimed the Timewyrm, clearly shocked. Its form swirled back into the metallic snake. In my kingdom I can harm your data structure. I can destroy your memory. Oh, you could when I allowed you to. The doctor affected nonchalance, his hands behind his back as he looked around the arena. I've never been here before. The pineal gland. Fascinating. Where's Ace? The Timewyrm waved a finger, somewhat perturbed. Two clowns marched the doctor's companion out into the arena. Ace could hardly believe it. The Timewyrm had reclaimed Boyle and kept her shut up in a dark little cell. A 4-next loop, as she rationalised it, a bit of the datascape she couldn't escape from. She had hoped, had thought, that the doctor would somehow get her out, but she didn't expect this. She stared at the doctor in amazement. The idiot had come back for her. She couldn't help but feel glad, though. The expression of casual control on his face was a joy to see. The doctor was back. She wanted to dash up and hug him, but instead she just sauntered over, not letting the clowns rush her. Strange that they didn't bother her now. It was just a silly childhood thing, one of those fears that leave you with experience, and God had she got experience. Yo, Professor, she called. I thought you were out of here. I changed my mind, the doctor smiled. He looked up at the assembled dark masses of the crowd. All the world's a stage I'm going through. Yeah, well, that's not what I call a good audience. Ace nodded up at the ranks of ancient demons that surrounded them. No, they probably wouldn't appreciate a quick burst on the spoons. Glancing over her shoulder, Ace noticed that the Timewyrm had vanished. The crowd was roaring with anticipation. It was like the few seconds before kick-off, Ace realised. The spectators waiting for the big moment. A hum of power was building in the amphitheatre, and the smell was crackling with tension. The smell of brimstone was getting stronger all the time. Ace, the doctor murmured, it's time. Get in the TARDIS. Not yet, Ace replied, and put a finger up to the Time Lord's lips as he was about to order her more strongly. I've got to find Chad Boyle. It's kind of my fault that he's here. The doctor might have been about to argue, but at that moment the spotlight blazed into life again, picking out a figure that stood in the archway that led into the amphitheatre. A squat figure, eyes blazing. The Timewyrm had possessed her favourite host one last time. Boilworm stepped forward, lifting claws of burnished steel. The doctor turned carefully to face the creature. The audience roared its appreciation, stamping feet and hooves, thrashing tails. So, the Timewyrm whispered, it comes to this, as it always had to. The doctor and the virus. Why didn't you kill me, Time Lord? Because my friend did me a great service. The doctor met the being's gaze calmly. She showed me that there was another option. If I destroyed you, you would only have returned in time. Like my guilt, my remorse, you're part of a terrible cycle. I can't take your life, I refuse to. But I can give you peace. Come with me, Ishtar. Let me help you. Why should I trust you? I asked the same question. Ace stepped forward, a little surprised at her own confidence. You trust him because you have to trust somebody. Okay, so he's made a few mistakes, but he's on the case now. Ace paused and looked the doctor in the eye. I trust you, Doctor. A strange look passed over the doctor's face, and for a moment Ace thought that the Time Lord was going to cry. But just as quickly, the look vanished and was replaced by an utter conviction. I swear to you, Ishtar, if you're still in control of that organism, I mean you no harm. You lie! Screamed the tiny figure, puffs of fire flaring from its metal nostrils. This is another game. I have beaten you once. I will do so again. I will kill your conscious mind here and now, take over your form and pillage the universe. I will feed on your precious earth. If you're going to be so stupid, Ace shouted, then give back Chad Boyle. He doesn't deserve all this. Chad Boyle, cried the Timewyrm, a tiny life form. I feast on whole worlds. The little body that the Timewyrm inhabited started to jerk and contort, the muscles spasming under some inner tension. The legs gave way, and it fell to the floor, thrashing. With a sickening splintering of bone, the body of Chad Boyle split open. Gouts of blood poured from the tearing flesh as huge coils of gleaming metal burst from it. The dragon maw swept upwards from the neck, its expression triumphant. The shreds of Chad Boyle's human form were swept away under the gleaming bulk of the vast metal lami, its claws brushing aside scraps of frail humanity until there was nothing left to mark the child's passing. The Timewyrm had assumed its true form. Ace found herself weeping, angry at anything that could sweep aside a human life like that. It took her a moment before she realised who she was weeping for. Chad Boyle, her tormentor. She hoped there was a heaven for him somewhere. The doctor watched, his face dark with ancient power. The Timewyrm thrashed about the arena, drawing energy from the assembled demons of the unconscious. They squelched and squealed and faded away, dissolving into a boiling ocean of dark steam which rolled around the seating as it itself dissolved, sucked into the growing form of the Timewyrm. The arms grew, huge scimitar claws bursting from the fingers. Legs and torso were blended into a gigantic lashing tail of shining chrome. The angles of the dragon head crushed in upon themselves, smoothing into the features of a young woman. The pupils of the Timewyrm's eyes, the last vestige of Boyle's soul, vanished inwards to reappear a moment later in a shade of red, glowing with angry intelligence. The new form cried out in pain and triumph. "Get in the TARDIS!" the doctor shouted to Ace. "Now!" Ace dived for the door of the timecraft, dizzy as the surroundings spun faster and faster, their colours and shapes blurring into a void of pure white. All there was left was the reassuring blue shape of the police box and the two adversaries, Time Lord and Timewyrm, facing each other. Katika's transformed self towered over the tiny figure of the doctor. As Ace watched, peering out of the door, the creature raised its head, bellowing. "Don't be a fool!" the doctor was yelling. "There's no reason to fight, nothing left for you to gain." "Your death, Doctor!" bellowed the monster. "Your death!" It blew a jet of blue flame straight at the tiny form below it, and the doctor screamed, his clothes catching fire and his flesh withering beneath the assault. Whatever power he had summoned to heal his form, it was not infinite. He stumbled forward, raising a hand to protect himself, and the Timewyrm leaned forward, opening her mouth to consume this arrogant insect. The doctor glanced backwards at Ace, and in that second the woman from Perivale saw a kind of pride in his face. It was as if he was saying goodbye. The doctor turned back and glared up into the jaws that were descending on him. "Too much death, too many conflicts," he shouted at the Timewyrm. This must end now. Begone! He reached out and touched the creature. The universe exploded with light. In a rose garden, the first Doctor gazed down at the perfect bloom that the fifth Doctor had brought him. The Sarlane. It had taken well to the garden, and the old Doctor smiled and nodded. This was the bloom that he had been trying to cultivate for so long. The younger Doctor smiled, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and stood up from where he had been squatting, admiring the flower. "Well, I must get on," he smiled. "There's the ground to prepare, and I have to get my old bat out of storage. It's good to be out and about again. Will you be there for the match?" "Of course," giggled the old man, clutching the lapel of his scarlet Pridonian robes. "I have always been there for the game." The Doctor floated in nothingness, his form encompassing 1 billion pinprick galaxies, a slow burst of nuclear life. The rough sphere of the cosmos blossomed within him, growing as he watched, life pushing forward against the shade of night. As he gazed, cosmic civilizations rose and fell, concepts of order and chaos waxed and waned, and languages flared into life and died with their cultures, each reaching to describe what the Doctor carried inside him. All failing. The moment went on forever, the Doctor contemplating the inner progression as a passage of endless music, an infinite remix as one theme arose to counterpoint another, life and death and resurrection. In the surging galaxies, haloed by blazing quasars, stars bloomed and collapsed, clusters broke against each other like waves under the rule of gravity. Laws were formed from the way matter played with matter, laws that were broken at the surface and centre of the sphere. And in another moment, there was the Timewyrm. As the poets of many cultures had glimpsed it, it encircled the globe of the universe, and hence the Doctor. It swallowed its own tail, endlessly feeding on its own selfhood. It was everything there was and would be. Fighting it would be like battling a pattern or shouting against a storm. Its scales reflected the light of the cosmos and all its tiny battles. Yet, inside this conception, this grand poem of encirclement, a single life still blazed. Obviously, the Timewyrm was as much a part of life as breathing or blood. It was what cats howled at on August nights, what the Curuli traced across the skies of their dreamtime, what babies were thinking of at the instant of their birth. The Doctor reached out and touched the life. It was a short life and an infinite one. Kataka had known love and pity and laughter. The Doctor simply presented himself to her, and she saw in him what her mechanical form could not. She said yes. She wanted to go home. The Timewyrm felt its essence dissolving, computed the approaching fact of its dissolution. The head reared up from its own tail, roared towards the Doctor, impacted in a ripple that disturbed the evolution of whole clusters of galaxies. They fought in the biology, poetry and astronomy of 1,000 races, the stellar man battling the snake. The snake was about to seize the man's neck, the storytellers said. And then the man smiled. Saul laughed. "What is it, Saul?" The Reverend Trelaw looked up in alarm. The laughter had startled Peter and Emily too. They had been watching Ace's form nervously, waiting for something, anything to happen. "I do not know," laughed Saul. "It just strikes me that the universe is a very humorous place." Peter made a twirl with his finger against his skull, and then was amazed to discover that his wife was laughing too. "Yes," she giggled, "I know exactly what you mean. It's wonderful. It's like the whole world has just gone on holiday." Trelaw couldn't resist a smile himself. The baby that he was holding began to wave a hand around, the first real movement that it had made. One finger wavered into a vague pointing gesture. "And what are you trying to tell us?" the vicar asked. There was a sudden blast of colour, a sound beyond sound. Emily had time to open her mouth, Peter to grasp the baby to his chest. The church shuddered with some tremendous power. Trelaw, though he would not later confess it, swore he heard a voice old and terrible, echoing down the corridors from a time before time itself. "Go home," said the voice. With a roar like the tide receding, sunlight burst into the church, real winter sunlight, suffused with snowy air and distant clouds. A chorus of rooks flapped up from nearby trees in a blast of sound, and Saul shouted with all his might, "Home! We have come home!" Peter and Emily hugged each other, and Trelaw fell to his knees, giving heartfelt thanks to his Lord. Under Saul's power, the doors burst open and a burst of freezing air rushed into the church. It was late afternoon, and the village of Cheldon Boniface was alive in the little hollow below the hill where St. Christopher's stood. Smoke rose from chimneys, and distant sounds of children playing and dogs barking floated on the chill breeze. "But how?" cried Saul. "I saw this place destroyed. I saw it." "Look!" cried Emily, dashing over to where Ace lay. The young woman was stirring, her hands rising up to her face. She sat up quite suddenly and looked around. "Doctor?" she asked. Emily hugged her suddenly, and Ace found herself clutching the woman in return. "You came to rescue me!" Ace gasped. "He did it! The stupid old man! He sacrificed himself to get me home!" The two women parted for a second and looked at each other. Then they both began to sob and embraced again. In amongst their sobs came choking laughter. Peter would have made a wry comment, but putting his hand to his cheek, he found that he too was sobbing uncontrollably. He sat down beside the two of them and encompassed them all in his arms. Trelaw stood back a little, holding Saul in that special mental space they shared. A few moments went by in which nothing but grateful weeping could be heard. "Fear makes companions of us all," he whispered after a little while. The whole universe, calm, seen from this far off. Inside that globe were battles, conflicts, fierce adventure. Here in the space outside the stars there was only peace and reconciliation now. If he went back, he would have to fight again. He could stay here at one with the cosmos without ever encountering it on an individual basis. He could keep his distant sense of scale, enjoy real peace, oneness and calm, or conflict and pain. The doctor looked down on the stars and sighed. Ah well, pain it was. "He's gone." Ace wiped her face on her sleeve. "But that's okay. That's really okay. He finished off the Timewyrm, I think." "We owe him much," chorused Saul. "I have examined broadcasts from the outside world, and it seems as if the blast which destroyed the village never happened." "What blast?" asked Ace. "Exactly," concluded Saul. I must write a paper for the Royal Society," Peter muttered. "This whole experience, the whole—" He waved his arms vaguely. "No, love," murmured Emily, who still had an arm looped through Ace's. "They'd have you certified. I'll write a novel instead." "There's no place like home," Ace sighed, patting Emily's arm and disengaging from her to move towards the doors. She looked out over the countryside. Her past was back, complete and lovely, a gorgeous catalogue of fond memories, people and places, alive with the recollection. That's what they say, anyway. They're right to. Maybe there are some places better, but there's nothing that smells the same, feels the same. I didn't really get to know him very well. Emily moved to stand beside her. But the doctor seemed to be a very good man. Yeah, and he didn't get that either. Ace watched a dove alight on a gravestone in the churchyard. He knew all about the good bit, about what was expected of him, but he never caught on to being a man. I don't know why I feel so happy about all this. Maybe in a few days I'll start grieving, eh? Perhaps so, Emily smiled. I just get the feeling that he's still out there somewhere. Ace stared out over the encroaching mist, blinking against the low winter sun. Somewhere? She caught a familiar sound, distant, like something heard on the edge of a dream. Maybe it was only a memory, but it meant so much. It meant freedom, a love that embraced the alien, the outsider, and the oppressed. This sound couldn't tolerate hatred and violence, but found itself unable to be silent in the face of evil. That's why it rended, tore its way across time. To Ace, the wheezing, groaning sound seemed to be blown from the distance on some Christmas breeze, a legend as silly and as powerful as Santa Claus in the gathering twilight. But the sound was real. It grew in strength every second. Ace spun round, grinning her head off. "Never!" she smiled, sniffing. "It can't be!" The TARDIS roared into life in the aisle, the light on its roof blazing, and settled with a clump of halting machinery. A second later, the door burst open. "Doctor!" shouted Ace. The doctor stumbled out, clutching his head and shouting incoherently. "So let me grasp the rose that grows inside under the surface," he yelled. "Allow me strength and not to hide, or give me a friend who seeks to lie." With a great effort he grasped the baby in Trellaw's arms and pressed his forehead to it. "And let my mind do no more fighting." There was a blaze of blue static between the foreheads. The doctor rocked back on his heels and gazed down at the baby. The child seemed suddenly possessed, its hands clenched into fists, and it looked around itself, an intelligence seeming to fill it for the first time. "You've put the Timewyrm in the baby," Ace realised, running to the doctor's side and supporting him. "But isn't that—" "Hush," the doctor murmured unsteadily. "Watch." The baby seemed about to lift itself up out of Trellaw's grasp. It raised its fists over its head and glared at the world angrily. Then it let out a mighty howl and started to cry. "I think it's hungry," murmured the doctor. "The poor thing hasn't been fed in hours." Trellaw gazed down at the child in awe. "What do we feed it?" he whispered. "Milk." The doctor picked up the baby and handed it to Peter and Emily. "You two had better find some. Call her Ishtar. It'll mean some problems in the playground, but," and he glanced back to Ace, "some of us benefit through adversity." Emily stared at the baby in her arms. The infant reached up and gripped the doctor's finger. He smiled a giddy smile, and then he fell over.